Howdy folks, hope you're all having a good one, and welcome back to World of Warships with Rear Admiral Jingles. And today a ship is going to be losing its salt mine Cherry as we feature it here for the very first time. It is of course the brand new, all singing, all dancing German Tier 10 so-called destroyer, the Elbing, and it's being played for us by Laser 14344. And the reason why I say so-called destroyer is because, well, just look at the thing. This thing was actually conceptually a reconnaissance cruiser. Not entirely sure what the Germans meant with the phrase reconnaissance cruiser, because I'm fairly sure that all light cruisers generally tend to fill the reconnaissance role, but hey, here it is. And I'm not joking when I say light cruisers. This thing is armed with 150mm guns, 6-inch guns, the standard armament of your light cruiser. In fact, there are light cruisers in this game that have lower caliber guns than those found on the Elbing. These are, to all intents and purposes, exactly the same guns as you find on the German Tier 8 premium light cruiser, the Mines. In fact, the only real concession to this being a destroyer and not a light cruiser is that it doesn't have the 17.5-kilometer range that these same guns on the Mines have. It's still pretty bloody impressive though. The Elbing's 150mm guns have a stock range of 13.3 kilometers, although with the judicious application of some German sorcery, and probably some signal flags, lasers managed to get the range up to 13.5. The guns are 60 calibers long, exactly the same as the ones on the Mines, and they have exactly the same nearly 1,000 meter per second shell velocity. This high velocity gives them better than average penetration, although there is a trade-off. The high explosive shells are absolutely terrible. I mean, they are really bad. And the guns also have a slow reload, which means that the Elbing is definitely not the kind of destroyer that you want to be in when it comes to fighting other destroyers. Exacerbating this are a couple of other factors. She's not very fast, with a top speed of only 36.5 knots and no access to the engine boost consumable, and she's really, really big, which I may have already mentioned, but, well, just take a look at this to put it into some perspective for you. There you go, as you can quite clearly see in this little comparison chart provided by Choman of the Southeast Asian server. Elbing is really, really big. It's the biggest Tier 10 destroyer in World of Warships. It displaces twice the tonnage of other Tier 10 destroyers like the Yu Yang, Summers, Daring, Gearing, Halland, Schmalland, Shimakaze, Z-52, Grozovoi, Hayati, and so on and so on. It is, by far, the chonkiest of chonky Tier 10 destroyer boys. A lollyboat, it is very definitely not. The Elbing is basically a light cruiser, in all but one very, very important respect. Light cruisers have citadels. Destroyers do not. You cannot citadel the Elbing, because it is classified as a destroyer. But the Elbing can citadel you. Oh yes it can. Unless, of course, you also happen to be in a destroyer, like the Shimakaze over there. Because if you're firing these armour-piercing shells at another destroyer, you're probably just going to overpenetrate in exactly the same way that a light cruiser would probably just overpenetrate. And if you're firing the high explosive shells, you're not going to do a lot of damage, because the high explosive shells are terrible. They have amongst the lowest high explosive alpha damage of any tier 10 destroyer, and they have a really slow 7.1 second reload. Although they do have the highest penetration values of any tier 10 destroyer, because these are 150mm German guns, so they get the quarter caliber penetration rule, which means that the HE shells have 38mm of penetration. You might think that would make this destroyer absolutely ideal for shelling battleships, but you'd be wrong, not just because the high explosive shells do terrible damage, but the armour piercing gets the job done. As long as the enemy is polite enough to give you a nice flat broadside to shoot at, like the Vermont was just there, which allowed Laser to rack up a nice easy 18,000 damage in just a couple of seconds. Unfortunately, as soon as a target starts to angle, like the Des Moines over there, you start to run into the same problems experienced by other light cruisers firing armour piercing and angled armoured targets. You get a lot of bounces. Now you can overcome this problem, which is what Laser is doing here, at least initially, by farming damage on the enemy ship's superstructure instead, but at some point that's going to become damage saturated, at which point you're going to have to hope for one of two things to happen. The enemy is dumb enough to give you the broadside to shoot at instead. And yeah, that was an 8,000 damage salvo from a destroyer. Yeah, I know. Yeah. Or you can just cross your fingers and load the high explosive. But it's always better to fire armour piercing in the Elbing if that armour piercing is able to penetrate, because it just does so much more damage. Now, if you've previously ground your way up the German cruiser line, at least until you get to tier 7 in the York, this is something that you're probably already familiar with, because German light cruiser high explosive is pretty bad and the armour piercing is pretty good. And it's exactly the same here on the Elbing. The comparison doesn't hold completely true, of course, because despite looking like a cruiser, sounding like a cruiser, smelling like a cruiser and tasting like a cruiser, the Elbing is in fact a destroyer. It's just a destroyer that's really bad at fighting other destroyers and definitely prefers fighting enemy cruisers, particularly light cruisers. And here comes the enemy Shimakaze again to demonstrate. Now remember, when Laser was lighting up the Salem and the Vermont earlier, he was getting 6 to 9,000 damage salvos. Look at the numbers here. It's all the over-penetrations. In fact, in some cases, he's lucky to even do 1,000 damage every time he fires. Now, you might just be sitting there thinking, well, why doesn't he just load the high explosive? And yeah, I mean, I think he probably would have been doing better if he'd loaded the high explosive here, but he wouldn't have been doing much better. And eventually he does switch to the high explosive. He's doing it now, and well, now you can see the performance of the high explosive shells. And yeah, against an enemy destroyer, it is better. It's still pretty bad though. The lesson here is that the Elbing is really not for fighting other destroyers, which is a bit unfortunate because there are 4 of them on the enemy team, although there's 1 less now. The Elbing is basically a light cruiser hunter, and it excels in that role. But here's the problem. How many light cruisers are in this battle? I'm going to say 1. Some people might say 3, some people might say 4 if they count the Elbing itself. There's a Minotaur on Laser's team, and there are 2 Alexander Nevskys on the enemy team, but I don't really classify the Nevsky as a light cruiser. It doesn't have 8-inch guns that you'd associate with a heavy cruiser, but it doesn't have the 6-inch guns that you'd associate with a light cruiser either. The Nevskys are armed with those Soviet 180mm guns, which are 7-inch guns because they're Russians and they just have to be different. They're like that with their destroyers as well. Everybody else has 127mm or 5-inch guns. The Russians have 130mm or 5.1-inch guns. Reminds me of something I read years ago, actually, although I'm pretty sure that this isn't for the same reason, but well, the communist bloc countries had this habit of making their weapons in a slightly larger caliber to those used by the West. So, for example, in Vietnam, American and ARVN forces were using 81mm mortars, but the Chinese supplied 82mm mortars used by the NVA were 82mm for a reason, because you can use an 81mm mortar bomb in an 82mm mortar tube, but you cannot do it the other way around. So they could use captured ammunition supplies. but you couldn't use their captured ammunition supplies. Yeah, those sneaky communists, they're always up to no good. You just can't trust them. I don't know how true this story is, but I know that Soviet and Chinese mortars were 82mm in caliber, and Western mortars typically were 81mm in caliber. That much is true. But it's a good story anyway, so I'm going to repeat it here. There's that Salem again. Armour piercing loaded, smoke screen deployed. The Salem, of course, while it has radar, it has the Walmart version of the Des Moines radar, significantly shorter range. Unfortunately, while he judged the range accurately, Laser forgot to take into account the fact that he was the one who was spotting the Salem. In fact, he was the one who was spotting everything out here. So he nudges out of the smoke screen to reacquire targets and sets eyes on the Thunderer. And the Thunderer has definitely seen the smoke screen, and he's swerving to avoid any torpedoes. But that means he's given a nice flat broadside, and he's not that far away. And these are extremely high velocity armour piercing shells. And holy shit, they're doing a lot of damage. See, that's the thing about these armour piercing shells. They do have very high penetration and very high shell velocity, and because the guns only have 13 and some kilometres change, and are also very accurate at the kind of ranges where it's even going to be possible to shoot at enemy cruisers and battleships, it's next to impossible to miss. And, well, as you can see, these shells are entirely capable of smashing their way through at these kind of ranges, even the armoured upper belt of a battleship. Now, even when you get a Citadel, they're not going to do huge amounts of damage because they are just 150mm guns, but even though the reload is absolutely underwhelming by destroyer standards, if you look at this thing as a light cruiser without a Citadel and a smoke screen, which is basically what it is, a 7.1 second reload isn't too bad. And it's actually a lot faster than 7.1 seconds now because he just activated the main battery loader talent after scoring 140 main battery hits. So Captain Gunter Lutyens, oh, hang on a second, watch where you're going, sunshine. Captain Gunter Lutyens is now exhorting the crew to load those guns 7.5% faster, which is nice. And that skill, in combination with whatever other crew skills and equipment modules he has fitted, means that Laser now has the main battery reload of his Elbing down to about 5 seconds, which is actually fairly reasonable even by destroyer standards. 125,000 damage firing almost exclusively armour-piercing shells in a destroyer without a single torpedo hit. We should probably talk about the torpedoes, because they're not bad. Oh, I've just realised. Oh dear. Well, it wouldn't be me if I didn't get something wrong. Oh, and there's the resilient talent. Okay, hang on. One thing at a time. Oh, that Zau's about to have an extremely bad day. Can you Citadel a Zau from this range with the Elbing? Yes, you can. Okay, so the resilient talent. With Gunter Lutyens as the captain, in an Elbing, that basically activates on getting 3 spotted ribbons and triggers a 3,000 hit point heal. The torpedoes, however, I have just realised, are the ones with a 13.5 kilometre range. I got a bit confused when I looked at the range circles on the minimap. His guns do have a 13.2 kilometre range. But those torpedoes will do just over 16,500 damage. They only have a 90-second reload, as you can see. They have a 13.5 kilometre range. They fire from 2 triple launchers, so you can only ever launch 6 torpedoes at a time. Unfortunately, the speed is absolutely terrible. I mean, there are Italian torpedoes that go faster than this. Top speed of 50 knots. Yeah, this is not a torpedo destroyer. It has torpedoes. They're not terrible, but you're going to be doing most of your damage and getting most of your kills with the guns firing armour-piercing ammunition. This match, Laser's first game in the Elbing, by the way, could still go either way. He took a fairly substantial amount of damage from the Salem, thirsty for vengeance, and now he's looking at knocking out the enemy Elbing. Actually, I think the enemy team had a couple of Elbings. Now, of course, they only have one. And what he was doing here, for those of you who don't know, you'll often see people doing this in replays. They lock onto a target with their torpedoes, even though they're not planning on torpedoing that target, but the torpedo aiming indicator gives them some idea of exactly what that target is up to, how fast it's going, which way it's going, and there he is again. And that enemy Elbing is in a pretty bad spot. He's got laser on one side and there's a gearing sneaking around on the other side, which he may or may not be aware of, although he might be by now because there go the gearing torpedoes, and I think the Petropavlovsk is shooting at him from the other side, down to the south. Oh, speaking of Russian Tier 10 cruisers, there's the Nevsky. Oh, he's radared. That'll be the Nevsky radar. Time to get out of here. Torpedoes away. You never know. They might hit something. Although if they do get lucky and hit the enemy Elbing, it will probably take 2 of them, because the Elbing has a shit ton of health as well. Oh no, Salem, what are you doing? Didn't you learn your lesson the first 2 times? Do not give broadside in a cruiser to the Elbing's armour piercing. And there's kill number 3. And the Elbing has also been sunk, but not by the gearing. Sunk by the Shimakaze, who followed the gearing and just didn't care about the Nevsky's radar. Speaking of which, oh, these cruisers, they will learn. One way or the other, they will learn. The Nevsky's taken a battering, but that Des Moines, oh dear. How many citadels do you reckon he's going to get here? There's one. Here come a few more. Here come a lot more. There's the Confederate Award. And there's the High Caliber Award. 5 citadels on the Des Moines. Cruiser captains, look, you know I love you, but we really need to have a chat. Anytime you see one of these Elbing destroyers, just tell yourself that it's a light cruiser. Don't think of it as a destroyer. Imagine that it's a British light cruiser that doesn't have a citadel. And if that thought doesn't terrify you and instill the proper level of fear and respect, you haven't been playing World of Warships long enough. Because that is basically what the Elbing is. 2 enemy ships left. Yeah, I don't think this is very close anymore. Laser's team have 2 caps. They have a small points advantage. But more importantly, they outnumber the enemy 5-2. Laser's torpedoes being overtaken by small pleasure yachts there. Looks like the Nevsky's about to die. It'd be nice if you could get the kill on the Nevsky. It would be a Kraken, but, well, I don't think it's going to happen. Too many other people shooting at it. There goes the... yeah, that was the Nevsky's radar, but then the Nevsky died. That's one way of dealing with the Nevsky's radar. Just the Shikishima, and he knows that Laser's here, and he's waiting for him to shoot so he can return fire, but, well, those are really, really big guns, and they're entirely unsuited for shooting at destroyers. He had his shot, it didn't do him any good, and he's gonna be dead before he gets to reload, especially if he gives broadside like that to an Elbing. He wants to get that rear turret firing, doesn't he? He's not going to get his wish. And that was 240,000 damage. A Kraken Unleash in a destroyer that isn't a Harugamo without a single torpedo hit. 3,300 base experience, and I'm sure it will surprise absolutely nobody to learn that of the nearly 244,000 damage that he did in his first game in this ship, 239,000 was done with his main battery armour-piercing shells. Laser 14344 in the German Tier 10 destroyer, apparently the Elbing, seems a bit crap on paper, but in actual fact it's quite terrifying. Hope you enjoyed today's video. Laser, well done on a thoroughly well-deserved win, and as always, take care, stay safe, and I'll catch you next time.